Upstream listeners, we're excited to announce Colson Center National Conference online for just $49. You can learn from Justin Bailey, Stephen Meyer, Briston Wagoner, and many more speakers from our annual Christian Worldview Conference. And if you use promo code UPSTREAM, you can receive $5 off. That's promo code UPSTREAM. For more information about this on-demand experience, visit colsonconference.org. Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the head springs of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. It's been over 10 years now since I and so many others watched Chuck Colson falter and fall on stage in the middle of a speech that would turn out to be his last. When he went home to the Lord not long after that, I remember the sense that an age had ended. Much the same feeling attended the death last month of another giant of American Christianity. Timothy Keller, pastor, theologian, author, and apologist, fell asleep after his long battle with pancreatic cancer at age 72. He left behind a truly extraordinary legacy of evangelism and church planting in one of the most hostile patches of ground in post-Christian America, New York City. But what made Keller such an influential and era-defining voice? What set him apart? What made him controversial in some circles? And what can we learn looking back on the well-run race of this remarkable servant of Christ? Today I welcome someone who's written a great deal about the life and work of Tim Keller, and whose recent biography will doubtless shape the conversation about this pastor for years to come. Collin Hansen serves as Vice President of Content and Editor-in-Chief at the Gospel Coalition, and is the author of Timothy Keller, His Spiritual and Intellectual Formation, plus a book you may have heard of called Young, Restless, and Reformed. He recently wrote a fascinating piece at Christianity Today entitled Tim Keller Practiced the Grace He Preached. And we're going to talk about that today. Collin Hansen, welcome to Upstream.
I'm very glad to be here. I'm excited for what we're going to discuss.
You know, I've talked to a number of people who knew Tim Keller and who interacted with him, and one of the things that comes out is just this repeated theme of he had no sense of pretension. He had no sense of being an important person. He made time for everybody. One of them, Jake Meter, a friend of mine, wrote just a remarkable piece summarizing his brief friendship with Keller and the time that he set aside, even as he knew he was in his final days, just to talk with Jake about the things that mattered to him and the questions he had. So right off the bat here, I want to ask you, how did you come to know about and come to know Tim Keller?
Yeah, so I'm one of those geriatric millennials. I was born in 1981. So when we were graduating college, going to grad school, or heading into ministry or things like that, that was right around September 11th, 2001. And we'd also grown up in the 1990s where New York was an obsession in many different ways. All these TV shows and everything that we watched were all based in New York. So to see that there's this pastor and he started a new church and it seems to be successful and he's speaking the gospel and leading a church in the midst of this, not only this location, but this time, September 11th. So I started to get to know about him a little bit there. I worked at Christianity Today magazine. Andy Crouch had written about him as well. I had that in the back of my mind. And then I started seminary in 2007. It's the year the Gospel Coalition had their first national conference. I covered it for Christianity Today magazine and got to meet Tim in that environment. And then, of course, 2008 was the year that my first book came out, Young, Restless, Reformed. But it's much more well-known for the year that Tim Keller's first two major books came out, Reason for God and The Prodigal God. And so in a lot of ways, in my basic Christian formation as a young adult, Tim Keller was just that voice who was being faithful, but also modern in a rapidly changing world. And as he mentioned, in a fairly hostile environment. But he was speaking to a wide variety of issues. And as I got to know him and then started working with him at the Gospel Coalition in 2010, it was really that broad-based engagement that was so compelling to me about how the gospel speaks to all of life. It speaks to our devotional life. It speaks to our intellectual life. It speaks to our service, our acts of service in the world. And sure enough, Tim had books for all of those different things over the years that he would come out with. So both personally, just in that relationship as colleagues and through the Gospel Coalition, but then also just as a young person who was reading and trying to find my own way in ministry, Tim Keller was a big role model there.
It's interesting you bring up your book, Young, Restless, and Reformed, and that's got to be one of the greatest titles of any book on American Christianity ever written, right? And not even just for those whose grandmothers watched the Young and the
Like mine
Restless,
did,
right?
yeah.
Right, exactly. Doesn't everybody's, I guess? But I guess the thing that strikes me and the thing that seems ironic about that title is that the first impression you got when you listened to Tim Keller was the lack of
Yeah,
restlessness,
that's right.
the lack of anxiety, the sense of confidence and cool-headedness and just generosity. Like when I thought in my early days of getting to know about him and reading him, when I thought about a conservative Presbyterian pastor ending up in New York City and having discussions with people who, to say the least, did not share his values and his belief system, I automatically thought a fight would happen, right? There's going to be a confrontation here. This is going to get messy real fast. And that's just not what happened when Tim Keller talked with unbelievers, with skeptics, with lapsed people, with the culture and the people in the culture that saw Christianity as what's wrong with the world, right? He was very non-anxious and very non-restless. What do you think was behind that in a meta view as we look back on a whole life and a whole ministry? What was going on in his head and his heart that led him to be that kind of person?
I think he just had time to get over it. I think he just exited the cage stage. One of the things that emerged in the context of research for my book was what was happening in the Pittsburgh area in the 1960s and the 1970s. Now, Tim grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, but his parents moved over to Western Pennsylvania. And one of the families that they got to know there were the Christie family from the Pittsburgh area. And that's Kathy, who would later become Tim's wife, Kathy Christie at the time. And one of the places that they would meet before they went off together, went to different colleges, went off together to Gordon Conwell, was Ligonier Valley Study Center with R.C. Sproul, where they were learning about people like Jonathan Edwards from Professor John Gerstner. Really, what you had seen in Pittsburgh during that time was a sort of reformed extension of the broader Jesus movement at the time. And so I think if you went back to that period of time, you'd find Tim to be quite a bit less staid, more restless, you might say, in his developing Reformed theology. Of course, this is the guy who also, as a student, helped to found what would become Table Talk magazine from Ligonier Ministries as a vehicle to be able to denounce his New Testament professors as being various heretics in the early church. So I think the main difference is that he simply got older and more mature, and he had to go be a pastor. And he had to go be a pastor in a context that was unlike anything he'd ever known before, rural Virginia, and in a context where if they didn't care about what snarky comments you could make about Reformed theology, they cared about whether you loved them and whether or not you could preach worth a lick and whether or not you'd show up to their Sweet 16 birthday parties, or whether you'd be them when a husband was drunk and ran away from home, or things like that. That's what they cared about. So you might say that restlessness it became a little bit more placid over time as he began to develop just maturity that comes from being a father and a pastor and then a professor at Westminster Seminary. And then ultimately, I think if Tim had stayed at Westminster Seminary as a professor, I don't think you would have seen anything substantially different from him as a pastor in New York City. What I'm saying is I don't think it was a strategy. I think his way of dialoguing, his way of talking with people, of evangelizing, of not picking those fights had just a lot to do with who he was as a person, his spiritual convictions, but also his personality. He was not a born fighter. I'll put it that way. He wasn't a born fighter. He was more of a let me put it this way. He was an analyst. You could not avoid him as an analyst. So instead of a pugilist, you would describe him as an analyst, like you'd be in an argument with him, but then he would sort of physically, almost you could feel him morph into an observer of the terrain as opposed to a combatant in that moment. And that was one of his key techniques to be able to diffuse. He used that with Christians, and he used it also in evangelism and apologetics with non-Christians as well.
Yeah, you see that in one of my favorite moments in Reason for God, which is probably still his best known book. And that's the apologetics one, right? It's
Yeah.
kind of the mere Christianity for Tim Keller. And one of my favorite moments in that is where he tackles this apparently very humble stance that modern people take and try to be very pluralistic, right? So all religions have part of the truth, and then they'll trot out the old parable about the blind men with the elephant, right? And they're all feeling a different part of the elephant. They're like, yeah, it's like a snake. No, it's like a spear. No, it's like a tree. No, it's like all these little, different observations based on their touching parts of the elephant. And Keller's observation is, this sounds so humble and so reasonable. It's like, yes, all the religions, they're feeling different parts of the same reality or the same God. And they all have the truth, just not the whole thing. So they just need to get over it. But he said, notice what's happening here. And you see him ascend out of the argument
Right.
into an observer of the terrain. You see him go, notice what you're asked to assume here is that there's an impartial observer who can see and who's looking at the whole elephant and can give you this revelation. It's like, notice the person giving you the parable always thinks they're that person, right? and he just totally does an end run around the otherwise pretty effective rhetorical argument and says, no, you need to notice what you're not seeing here. And then start, I love his phrase, doubt your doubts. Right? Get to that place where you can be the kind of observer I'm asking you to be. And that was, he did that again and again. It was so remarkable, his ability to do that. And it just depended, it seemed like, on the instinct to step out of the ring for a second and ask some more fundamental questions about the argument. I love that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was, I'm not sure exactly how he developed that technique. I don't think he and I talked about that. As I mentioned, I think it's part of his personality, but also it became kind of an addendum of what he would often attribute to Dan Strange over in the UK as subversive fulfillment, that the best way to argue against someone is not to say, you're right, I'm wrong, is to help them see why they are wrong on their own premises. And once they're destabilized, that's when you jump in and say, hey, well, you might not be able to get there on your path, but I can show you the path that will work to get there. That was a common strategy for him that you'll see everywhere you look, and describes it as subversive fulfillment.
One of the things you point out in your article at CT that I found just so interesting was that Tim Keller did not believe he had invented a strategy. Like you just said, he didn't believe he had invented a technique that he then thought was applicable in a sort of general way to other contexts or other churches or whatever. It seems like everybody else drew that conclusion. We got to do the Redeemer model, right? We got to imitate what they're doing, right? And there's nothing wrong with imitation, but it didn't seem like that was Tim's actual idea about what he had done. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know, Shane, how you would imitate Tim, even if you tried. Here's what I mean. The most common way that we would see Tim imitated in church leadership would be, okay, we need a church. It's going to be in the city center, and it's going to reach urban professionals, upwardly mobile urban professionals, maybe multi-ethnic, but especially Asian American and Caucasian. Okay, so we're going to do that. Well, how are we going to do this? Well, we need to quote their prophets. So we're going to quote the New York Times. Okay, so we got that. Then we're going to preach from the Old Testament narratives. We're going to preach, Christ-centered hermeneutics. Okay. All right. So all of those are very, very, very valid things that Tim Keller did. Here's the problem with that. Where does George Whitefield come into this? Because Whitefield was a massive inspiration for Tim with bold evangelism. Where does John Owen's work on the Holy Spirit and on sanctification come in? Because that was a huge influence on him as well. Well, how about C.S. Lewis, some of those quote-unquote modernist apologetics, or let alone some of Tolkien's narrative literary work there of the eucatastrophe, those concepts come in. We'll grab a little Flannery O'Connor in here for good measure. What about the dynamics of spiritual life that Richard Lovelace taught Tim about revival, especially working off Jonathan Edwards there? It's just impossible. I'm just giving the brief overview here. How could you synthesize all of those different things? And so the imitation comes with saying, oh, I get it. You reach young professionals by preaching Christ from all of Scripture and by quoting the New York Times. No, that may be part of it, and there's nothing wrong with any of that. But to get to the heart of it, you've got to do inductive Bible study that he learned from Barbara Boyd as a student, just close observation of the text. You've got to understand the dynamics of counseling and how change happens from his work with David Powlison for CCEF. all of those things are synthesized together. And so one of the reasons why so many of us look like pale imitations of Tim is because we can't possibly grab all the different things. We just grab a couple of the things that we like there. And especially for those of us who are younger, we were influenced by Tim in those things, not by the people who influenced Tim on those things. And so that is one of the major hopes behind this book, and a major reason why I think Tim was excited about it and why he collaborated with it, because he understood that vision was to not turn everybody into an imitation of him, but help others to see why he thought John Owen was so important, or Jonathan Edwards was so important, or George Whitefield was so important, or Elizabeth Elliot had taught him so much about authority and submission and things like that. So that's hopefully what comes across in there. But yeah, a lot of us are just pale imitations, unfortunately.
There's a kind of optimism that comes through as well, not just the unwillingness to be a pugilist, but also the sense that our work is going to be fruitful, that we should expect God to use our evangelism, to use our church planting, to use our engagement with skeptics to bring about results for the kingdom, right? And it seemed as if, and I like the remark you made, that Tim Keller was not the one who changed. There's been a sea change, and I don't want to be too negative or pessimistic here, but there has been a kind of sea change in evangelical attitudes as the post-Obergefell world has kind of unfolded, and the implications of a culture that's truly post-Christian have come home to roost. I think many of us have just adopted a sort of instinctive negativity, just a sense that, oh man, we are really in for it now, right? And that negativity puts you back in a defensive huddle. And one of the things that right up until the end, Tim Keller never showed was, I guess, that defensive huddle. He always had the optimism, the confidence, and the coolness of head. And one of the ways that really manifests, I think, is in this belief that cities can be reached. So obviously, because of the successful church in New York City, Tim Keller is associated with some kind of strategy for reaching cities. And that strategy presupposes a belief that cities can be reached, right? That we can't just write them off. But one of the negative attitudes I encounter is that, oh yeah, the city centers are gone. That's deep blue America. There's no way we can possibly reach those people. That's not our people. Help us to see the problems with that, because I think there are problems with it. And it sounds like you agree.
Yeah, you mean with the negativity about it.
Yeah. And then towards cities in particular.
Yeah. So, I think Tim's arguments about cities had morphed a little bit over time, because you might be able to say that there's the biblical theological argument about the narrative scripture and how it ends in a city in Revelation 21-22. You also see some glimpses of this when I had the brochure that they had used when they founded Redeemer Presbyterian Church. And certainly they talk about the influence. And so the New York is this epitome of culture and media and finance and all these kinds of things in there. So it's very strategic. You get the biblical argument, you got the strategic argument. More recently, especially under criticism, Tim was more likely to simply make the pragmatic argument, which was, hey, there are a lot of people in cities and we don't have enough churches there. That's it. It's as simple as that. People bear the image of God. There are lots of image bearers there. Therefore, God loves those people who are image bearers. I think some people are more instinctively, as you alluded to here, Shane, some of them are more instinctively defensive. Some of them are more distinctively missional. I think when you think about Tim's life and being in the Jesus movement, he experienced a revival under fairly hostile circumstances. So he was reacting against a very defensive culture. The fruit of that defensive evangelical fundamentalist culture was opposition to the civil rights movement and severe skepticism toward the Jesus movement. So he didn't really develop those defensive kind of instincts from that era. At the same time, he was utterly unimpressed with liberalism, because what he grew up with in college was existentialism. I mean, it's interesting how some intellectual fads will last and some just feel like relics of a different time. That kind of death of God movement feels like a relic. Just Time Magazine, God is Dead, all that kind of stuff. That's when Tim was in college. And he's getting all this Freud, like they stopped teaching Freud in the psychology classes, but they kept teaching him in the religion classes. God is a projection of ourselves. So he was just not impressed at all with liberalism, with those sorts of anti-Christian progressivism. So instinctively, we talk about this third way with him, but really it's just the basic evangelical enterprise of, well, we're not Catholic because the Reformation. We're not fundamentalists because we're trying to obey the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. We're trying to love our neighbors actively while also preaching the gospel to them. And we're seeing this amazing work of God in a contemporary movement, in the Jesus movement. And at the same time, we're definitely not liberals. So it's not so much just he was always trying to synthesize how do we do this and that, how we reach people. It was just like a basic optimism that the power of the gospel saves, especially when it is disenculturated. That's Richard Lovelace coming in. It's disenculturated from the fundamentalist trappings, disenculturated from the liberal fads, and disenculturated from this Catholic Church that supposedly never changes. That was the kind of Christianity that Tim Keller was converted into. And I think it's pretty safe to say that through whatever winds of change might have come over that period of time, and people could criticize him for this if they want, but that is simply the reigning paradigm that lasted for him his entire life.
His approach to apologetics and cultural engagement more broadly was often characterized, I guess rightly, as Kuyperian. And here at the Colson Center, we love Kuyper. Chuck was fond of quoting the every square inch statement of Kuyper's, and in many ways encapsulates a lot of his own theology. And I had recently Corey Brock and Grace Atanto on to talk about Neo-Calvinism, which is the tradition that emerges out of Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck's thought in the Netherlands. In many ways, Tim Keller sees himself as a recipient of a lot of that wisdom and someone who wants to apply it in the modern context. Could you talk to us about how he did that? What was distinctive about it? What were those Kuyperian insights that he found so helpful? And how is that distinct from the kinds of branded traditions that you just mentioned, like American fundamentalism or Catholicism?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting contrast in some ways. When I was one of the editors at Christianity Today, I actually edited Chuck's columns. And so I'll never forget just the amazing experience of being a young editor in a very unimpressive office and having the very well-tailored Chuck Colson walk into my office, sit down across from my desk, and ask me what I thought he should write about. That was one of the most spectacular acts of completely unfounded humility that I've ever seen in my career, that he thought that I would have actually something to add to him at the time. But one of the things that was pretty different in some ways between Chuck and Tim is that they did share a basic belief that the gospel is for all of life, that our faith is for every square inch. You just said it right there. That is the essence of Neo-Calvinism, and Chuck and Tim definitely shared that. But I think, and Shane, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, I think the major difference between them was probably generational. Now, again, they would have shared similar views on vocation. Okay, so that part of Neo-Calvinism, Tim's every good endeavor, that was, again, a major thing there. But I think generationally, Chuck was of the Billy Graham generation, whereas Tim was of the generation who followed. Billy Graham's encounters with politics, of course, which is very similar to Chuck's, the same period of time, of course, and different lessons learned with Chuck's conversion and jailing, all that sort of stuff.
Chuck did have some encounters with politics.
Exactly, he sure did. That's one way to put it. But my point is that there was a lot of disenchantment from people like Tim when it came to politics. And so when you talk about the broader Kuyperian tradition, it takes a really big caveat there because Chuck lived that out in a lot of ways. And Kuyper obviously did as the prime minister of the Netherlands. And yet that part didn't come up for Tim. That just wasn't a significant emphasis of his. He wasn't so much interested in a lot of the justice movements, for example, that Chuck led in, but he really cared a lot about mercy ministry. That was a major part of that work out there. And so it's just kind of interesting, the comparison and the contrasting, because I'm not sure I could speak with eloquence about the entire system and how it was appropriated and not appropriated by Tim in comparison to some others. But it's simply very clear that it's kind of weird to talk about the Neo-Calvinist tradition abstract from some of the levers of power in politics. But again, for better or worse, it just wasn't a part of what Tim took away from the tradition. He primarily took away from it the common grace, the all of life, the vocational discipleship, as well as the apologetics in an increasingly post-Christian society. Those were primarily the aspects that he pulled out, but he certainly was not a Kuyper type or a Billy Graham type who could have been great in politics, or Chuck, who obviously had many encounters, as we've discussed.
Exactly. Well, the apologetic attitude and approach of Neo-Calvinism is one of the things you do highlight in your Christianity Today piece, specifically with reference to an incident that occurred a number of years ago at Princeton Theological Seminary, where they had decided to award Keller the Kuyper Award,
Right.
and it was rescinded when, I guess, pressure came to bear over his opinions about his conservative views on women's ordination and gender and sexuality and things like that. Maybe abortion figured in there somewhere. At that point, I guess there are two options, and you kind of name these options, right? Somebody in his shoes could make a huge stink out of this and then say, this is the censorship on campus. He could go to the Daily Wire and do a whole thing. And we could map out very quickly here the strategy and what that looks like, and shaming Princeton Theological Seminary for this. But he did something different. He goes and gives the address, even though he's not getting the award. What do you see in that that's noteworthy or admirable? And how can we make use of that example?
I mean, I see Romans 12 at work. I mean, I see heaping burning coals. I see overcoming evil with good. When you listen to or watch the address there, which is one of his most profound engagements, primarily with Leslie Newbigin, sort of a little bit to his left in terms of missiology there, but had earlier given a talk at Princeton Theological Seminary, and that's what Tim is engaging with there. But what's so interesting when you listen to it and when you watch it is that the crowd loves Tim. And it's a little bit embarrassing to the president because you can tell that the crowd is trying to make a statement to the president of the seminary, because they give him this loud ovation at first, and then they give him this loud ovation at the end, and the president's like, we get it, guy. We understand. And so when you think about that, now look, let's be clear about something. This was at the peak of a lot of the worst campus cancellations. So maybe this is a viable strategy of being like the cheerful warrior, of just like going straight into the breach and saying, hey, I'm going to refuse to hate you. Even if you hate me, I'm going to refuse. I'm going to give the talk. I'm going to have a smile on my face, and we're just going to fight evil with good. Or maybe today they would have crowded the room and they would have shouted and chanted and never would have let him speak at all, even if he'd wanted to come. I'm not really sure, Shane. So, I think what I see there is I think he took the right strategy, and I think in many ways it is an example, but I don't want to oversell it, because some of the situations we're seeing on campuses now are truly dangerous in a lot of ways. But I do want to say one last thing that might give us some proper context. Tim was converted in 1970 at the peak of the Vietnam era protests, including the Kent State shooting, which would have been of students his age. It's not like he was unfamiliar with campuses being hostile places toward Christian orthodoxy.
Right.
He assumed that his entire life. So at some level, when that's baked in, you're maybe not as afraid or worked up about it or inclined to make a big show out of it, because after all, that's the only campus he ever knew.
I got to say, I look at a story like that and I watch his address, and I see a kind of, I know this is not a Protestant category, but I see a kind of work of supererogation there. In other words, I'm not persuaded that it would have been wrong for him to rake Princeton over the coals.
Sure. Yeah.
But what he did was like going above and beyond the simple call of I guess, cultural engagement and apologetic duties. Like, he actually took the next step and did something quite cool. And that's disarming for people too. If you won't fight, it's kind of that Luke Skywalker with the Emperor move. It's like, I'm not going to fight. I'm not going to fight here. It's like, you've lost. I'm not going to be that way.
Well, and he was formed by a pre-internet era where there was a certain assumption about the stability of institutions in some ways. And I think that's something that made it difficult sometimes for him on social media, because social media and the kind of various protests and things like that come out of it is simply not designed to facilitate any kind of shared movement toward conciliation or collaboration, let alone cooperation. It just doesn't lend itself toward that. It lends itself toward simply representing the other side in a certain light that will make you look good. And you kind of build your own audience based off how much other people hate you. One of the difficulties, I think, of why Tim was in some ways a bad match for the way things are playing out in the mid-21st century is because he couldn't gain strength through other people's hatred of him. And I think we can see how both the left and the right play those dynamics, and they're fairly effective, and sometimes they're even warranted for a variety of reasons. But the point is, when you're engaged in apologetics and evangelism as an institutional leader, you're trying to persuade, trying to build consensus. And social media works against that very substantially. And I think that's one reason why sometimes it just felt like a bad match for him, because he was trying to persuade in forums where you're like, hey, Tim, yeah, we don't do that here anymore. We're not trying to persuade anybody. We're just trying to score some points.
Hatred giving you strength definitely sounds like a Sith doctrine.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
Perfect tie-in there.
That's true. You're keeping it going. You're keeping the Star Wars references going.
I'm talking today with Collin Hansen, editor-in-chief at the Gospel Coalition and author of a biography on the late Timothy Keller. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this. Hi, this is Shane Morris. As we approach our fiscal year end here at the Colson Center, would you help us continue to equip individuals and institutions to bring restoration to their spheres of influence? You can support this work by giving at colsoncenter.org/FYE23. We're back on Upstream, talking with Collin Hansen, editor-in-chief at the Gospel Coalition, about the life and legacy of Timothy Keller. Collin, Timothy Keller also ended up becoming, in so many ways, this controversial figure among evangelicals on the right, which is, as you said, that's kind of an unexpected turn. I don't think he expected that, looking back on his years of formation. It just doesn't sound like he was ready for that weird turn. Post, I guess you could say it's post Obergefell, but really in the Trump years is kind of when you'd say that happened. Right. What was the cause of that? What was the root cause of that in your view? Well,
I think there's a lot of reasons for that. It's interesting that I was with him here in Birmingham, Alabama on Election Day in 2016. He was speaking here, and I remember making some sort of comment, and I felt like making a dig at him, and I was lamenting our choices, and I said, well, that's what happens when New York gives us both candidates. So I was trying to get a dig in on him there. But, I think not only, of course, did not a lot of us expect what happened on that election day, but really just a bad personality match in a lot of different ways, and a bad match for the way that those sort of pugilistic personalities would be able to gather so much attraction, so much attention in this particular media economy. It's interesting when you look back on it, another reason that he was caught flat-footed is because a lot of us in the South or the parts of the Midwest had an experience of change, that this used to be one way and now it's another, especially with related to sexuality. His mentality was, wait, when? I mean, because a child of the 60s who lived through the AIDS crisis in New York City, who came to New York City when it was not the kind of place that evangelicals even wanted to visit, let alone to go be part of a church. There was just this assumption all along of, wait a minute, we're in a pretty hostile world here, and I'm focused on planting churches in these areas that are fairly hostile. So I think one thing that caught him by surprise is that for so many other people, even including young people, they really had experienced something in the 90s and the 2000s that felt to them like a shocking change in 2010s with the Obama administration into then the backlash in a variety of ways in the Trump administration. And I think in some ways there was just a little bit of confusion of like, wait, maybe if you were more normalized to the 1960s and 1970s and that revolution. I mean, Shane, I did what were the things that happened in the year 1968, right as he was graduating high school and coming into college. And I think anybody who would identify Obergefell as a revolution, which it was and is, you'd have to say that 1968 provided at least as much, if not a lot more, of that revolutionary spirit. So I think maybe just in some ways, he'd been accustomed to being a rebel in some ways already because he was so clearly opposed to his mom in terms of her more fundamentalist religion that he was differentiating from. He didn't really fit in his college in the sense that he was the person who became an evangelical Christian when there was existentialism was all the rage. Then you jump forward to seminary. He's the reformed guy who's arguing against his professors. So at some level, he was always on the outside. There was always this kind of exilic posture, but that's exactly the opposite thought that many of us on the outside would have assumed of him being in New York. We would have thought of him as, oh, there's Tim Keller, the ultimate New York insider. When the reality was, his entire life, he was the ultimate evangelical outsider. That's how he thought about himself. And so I think just a kind of a weird mashup with especially, and notice that a lot of the critics are younger than him. And I think it's because they were working on a different chronological horizon than he had. So they sensed that things had changed a lot more. He was broadening the horizon to say, I'm not sure that, I mean, they have changed, sure, but in a broader horizon, there have been bigger changes that I've already kind of factored into my ministry.
You have to have a good memory to look back in your own development and think these kinds of thoughts. This is very important to do because when I look back on the last decade or so, a little more than a decade actually, and I think about when I first read Reason for God, it was probably in the 2010, 2011 timeframe. I forget when it came out. I remember encountering the word winsome. I think it occurs a few times in there. And this is the conversation within the conversation, right? This is something that I think we it's important to talk about here. And that word never struck me as strange. In fact, it struck me as quite a nice word. I remember when I first went through the Truth Project, which Focus on the Family put out. Del Tackett hosted that. And that was kind of a who's who of Christian apologetics and all that. That was in 2008. And I remember his whole mantra in that was actually that we should seek to be winsome and attractive to the outside world, that we should not be pugilistic and overly confrontational. And again, that struck no one in a very conservative context, at which I went through it twice. That struck no one as odd. It seemed quite normal. But yet all of a sudden, fast forward to, I guess it's not all of a sudden, it took a little while, but fast forward to the era we're talking about, this post-Obergefell, the Trump era, and now into the Biden years. The subculture of evangelical, maybe Southern, right-wing Christians have decided, I guess, that winsome is a controversial word. So this is something that has now become freighted, and it'll start arguments when you talk to someone about being winsome in our apologetics. What do you think happened there? And then what's your perspective, having studied Tim Keller's reactions to this whole thing?
Yeah, so again, I'm going to try to broaden the horizon here. So one of the key scholars and one of the key texts that Tim would often cite, and that is one of my absolute favorites, is Larry Hurtado's book, Destroyer of the Gods. Absolutely love that book. I teach it a lot in my own cultural apologetics. One of the things that he describes in there are the characteristics of the second century church. And he describes the second century church as being accessible and odd. And you realize that that was the paradigm that Tim has been working from. So people have often attributed Tim to say he's winsome. Okay, by which they mean, well, he's not Donald Trump. I mean, he really just, he's a nicer guy. He's trying to make an appeal, trying to make his arguments look beautiful, trying to make them look compelling, trying to relate with the other people. The other thing that's a factor here is actually that goes back to the Neo-Calvinism. It's because his approach is based not off utter dichotomy, but on building bridges with common grace. So he starts from the premise that you believe good things because you're made in the image of God, but they're disordered by the fall. And I'm going to show you why they're disordered, but I'm going to appeal to our fundamental agreement as made in the image of God. That's another reason why he's just very different, and why people think the winsome thing doesn't work is because they're coming from different perspectives where there's a sharper dichotomy. They're not trying to build that ground first in terms of common grace. But if you go back again and you look at the accessible and odd dynamic, what you realize is that, yes, Tim was saying that we always need to make the gospel accessible for people to understand, and also that we should try to make it appealing because it's good news. That's the whole definition. It's good news. At the same time, we are going to be odd. We are going to be different. There are people who are going to hate us. He always kept going back to 1 Peter, this dynamic that as people see your good works, they will also hate you. They kept coming back to that same dynamic in there. And I think, Shane, that at some level, I think people just maybe don't pay attention to that part of him, or maybe just dispositionally that didn't sound the same to them because he doesn't sound like Trump or a Doug Wilson or somebody like that. That's just not his personality. I mean, I don't know what else to say. I'm not sure how much of a strategy this, just not his personality. But what's interesting is that church and his ministry from the beginning in New York was very controversial. And in fact, in my book, I mentioned one of those incidents where a media member shows up and is commenting to Timothy Keller and says, Kathy says, can you believe that all these young people are here and we teach against premarital sex? And the journalist just laughs and says, that would be something crazy, wouldn't it? And Kathy says, no, that's what we actually believe.
Yeah.
And the journalist just doesn't make any sense. So, we might look back on that period of the early 1990s and say, oh, it was so quaint or even conservative in some ways. Like, no. The fact that as a Christian, you would say that you're not supposed to have sex outside of marriage between one man and one woman was at least as controversial back then as it is now. So I think it's just those two things going hand in hand of, yes, he did believe that we should be winsome, the gospel should be accessible, it should be appealing. At the same time, our community is going to be odd and even hated sometimes, but we should be hated for things that we actually believe, not hated for things that we don't believe. And now here's where things do get controversial. Also, probably not hated because of our partisan political commitments. That's where the actual disagreement comes in. And I do think there's plenty of room for some substantial dialogue there about how our political parties have changed over time, and especially how the culture wars have played into those dichotomies, as well as how much a certain commitment to causes for justice might end up committing us to partisan approaches to them. That wasn't something that Tim was very comfortable with, but it's entirely possible that younger generations will decide that that's just not the path that they want to follow. That's where the real disagreement comes in.
That's a really helpful summary. Thank you for that, Collin. For those who don't know the background on a lot of this, and this is sort of tempest in a teapot kind of stuff, so be forewarned, but there was an essay a while back by Aaron Renn. It was at the American Reformer. And this is the essay that kind of set the terms of this debate, as far as I can tell. And it was about, not just about Tim Keller, but about this winsome approach to apologetics and cultural engagement. And it used the kind of analogy or rubric of three worlds in which Christians have lived in the past several generations. So there was positive world, once upon a time where Christianity, being a Christian, was actually a social benefit to you. Like, it was good to be a Christian. In some ways, you were expected to be a Christian. Public shows of piety were actually a net positive for you. And then there's neutral world, which is what most of us grew up in, where being a Christian is not exactly positive anymore, but it's not really a negative either. It's kind of indifferent. It's like this weird hobby, it's kind of like stamp collecting. And if you're a Jesus freak, well, it's not because people view you as evil for believing in Jesus. It's just because that's a little bit freaky and you seem really interested in it. But hey, you do you, right? That's neutral world. Renn's thesis was that we transitioned at some point, probably around Obergefell, into what he calls negative world, where being a Christian became actually a serious detriment to you socially or politically or academically or whatever. And the argument is, and I've heard his thesis used this way very aggressively, is that Tim Keller was a man left in the past. He got left in neutral world, and he just did not know how to cope with negative world. It just sort of caught him flat-footed, like you said. Real talk here. What's your perspective on that? Do you think that there's some truth to that, or do you think that it's a misreading of Keller and perhaps our cultural situation?
I would say that Tim was somebody who was stuck in the past, by which I mean the second century church, or by which I mean the 1960s and the 1970s is what I've been saying in here. I think one of the dangers of essay analysis, of which I do a lot, admittedly, there is that it can oversimplify things and it can flatten out more complex narratives. And I think the reason why that narrative doesn't particularly align well with Tim is because it wasn't the New York that he knew. He did not follow that trend. There was not a non-negative world for Tim Keller in New York City, in the sense of, by the time I've read about this in my book, the early 20th century on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, you had about a quarter of folks on the Upper East Side of Manhattan were evangelical church-going Christians in the early 1900s. By the post-war period and then the late into the 20th century, that's virtually evaporated to the point where you can identify on one hand all of the evangelical congregations in Manhattan. This is a city where in the 19th century in Manhattan, it would have been considered the capital of Christianity in America. So the narrative that he stepped into, it was negative already. It just would not have aligned with that analysis. And some of that had to do with sexuality. There's no doubt about it. But really, it was a broader historical narrative. What I talk about is what I've seen other people observe, which is that in the early 20th century in Manhattan, the negative world would have been for you believing in the virgin birth of Jesus Christ or the physical resurrection or the vicarious or substitutionary atonement. Those were the beliefs that were hated. Those were the negative views. And in fact, there was a group called liberal evangelicals who emerged during that period of time, whose argument was to say, we've got something really good here. We just need to get rid of these supernatural beliefs that are frankly embarrassing to such an educated group of people. And then we're going to be fine because you know what we have? We have the morals, because everybody knows that to be a good, upstanding Christian in this world, you need to be heterosexual and you need to be married and you need to have lots of children. And that's what it means. That's the story there in New York City. And of course, you can see that that's all of a sudden flipped in the 21st century of now all of a sudden it's like, I don't really care what you believe, all sorts of wild supernatural things, because you wouldn't believe what I what I would say about those things. And at the same time, oh no, don't you dare practice any of those bigoted things like having a bunch of children or on and on and on there. So that's why I think sometimes our essay analysis can spread really quickly because it gives us a sense of true understanding. It puts words to our experiences. But Tim Keller, and this is one thing I've learned from him, he was a person of the past in the sense of Scripture is our norm, and the church's history gives us a lot of context to be able to understand. And I think what it helps you to do is to not be overly reactionary or reductionist, and instead to simply try to maintain a relative consistency with the church's discipleship over the centuries, which is expect that a lot of people are going to respond positively to the gospel, and maybe even more people, or at least as many people, are going to hate you for that. And after all, isn't that just what we're told in the Bible about the aroma of salvation? To some, it's life; to others, it's death. So I would say that's the kind of framing that he had. Now, I'll make one caveat here in the end, and that one caveat is that, and I'll put this in my words now, I would say that the internet is this gasoline on the fire of expressive individualism. Tim was a big opponent opponent of what Robert Bellah had termed expressive individualism, and in his book Habits of the Heart. And these things that we read about in that book of the Sheilaism, how every American has their own personal religion, that has accelerated through that gas just dumped on the fire. And you see that especially through sexual orientation, gender identity, all that kind of stuff. And there is no doubt that Tim recognized in New York on that issue, yes, there is a very different kind of situation now that you see in younger generations. I just read Gene Twenge's book, Generations, and I don't think anybody could be confused about what's happening in Gen Z in the aggregate in terms of the pressure on them related to different configurations on sexual orientation and gender identity. And he clearly did recognize that change and recognize that that would be a massive challenge for the church and that we need new counter catechesis and discipleship specifically related at questions of identity.
That's extremely helpful. I appreciate also that you mentioned the sense that we're living in something like the second century that Tim had. So the negativity of the culture is like taken for granted. And this leads to, and this is the last question I'll ask about this. I really think that we could bring this to a helpful spot though. And I did want to have this discussion, and that is that I see these two opposite poles that in many ways are equally, I look at them as equally silly or unrealistic. And this is just me speaking for myself here. On the one hand, you've got kind of, and it's been labeled the Christian nationalist idea where here's what we're going to do. We're going to take over the country and run it as Christians, right? And there are all kinds of ideas for how this sort of thing will happen. And the comical thing about that is that we've never been less likely to actually be able to accomplish
Which
that.
is why we're talking about it, because it's not remotely feasible.
Right. It's extremely, the whole thing is extremely armchair.
Right.
And then on the other side, you've got this other impulse that says, hey, 3 cheers for the end of cultural Christianity because that was distracting. And now we can get down to the business of being persecuted and being really Christian for real. This will be good for us. I look at that as equally silly too, because cultural Christianity obviously does a lot of good things. It sets up a plausibility structure in which salvation is easier for one thing. I mean, I can say that, but it's like, it doesn't tackle realistically or doesn't grapple realistically with what a Christian society does for people in terms of justice and everything. So in the middle here, you've got this, dare I say it, third way. There's this sense that, okay, we recognize the reality of where we're at. We're not going to be taking over anytime soon, not here, not in this country. But at the same time, we can recognize the things that have been lost in that de-Christianization process. And so we move forward pragmatically on the basis of what we know to be true. What does our strategy look like? And it seems to me that a responsible, honest, and charitable reading of Tim Keller's work in the later years of his life is exactly that he's looking for a way forward in the midst of what he perceives to be the real situation, without having delusions of grandeur and also without applauding the serious losses that we've suffered. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So let's just take, for example, let's go to the heart of the matter. Let's look at his writing on critical race theory. Okay. So I don't think there's any real reason for his work on critical race theory to be very controversial at all, except insofar as it doesn't really neatly align with any of the partisan formations there. But I think this is one reason why a lot of Christians don't feel really at home in these broader media and political spectacles. So, for example, he says, a lot of the specific assumptions of critical race theory are plainly unbiblical and anti-biblical. And he goes through and he writes about all the different ways that's true. Like, it's going to be really hard to baptize Ibram Kendi as anything that we can really work with. Okay. At the same time, oh man, there's all sorts of historic injustices with ongoing consequences that unfortunately a lot of Christians have ignored or have dismissed as if they're somehow only relics of the past. But unfortunately, we're still living with the legacy and in a variety of different ways. And there's more that we probably have to do to be able to address those concerns. I don't think that needs to be all that controversial, but that is why people would say a third way, like, no, just pick a side. Is it critical race theory or is it anti-critical race theory? And he's like, well, as a Christian, I cannot agree with critical race theory, but I have to talk about all of the problems here that some have used to be able to justify critical race theory. Then you come back and one of the things that a lot of people have overlooked is a little essay that Kathy wrote in 2020 or 2021, and it was about the priority of evangelism. And this, of course, as you know, Shane, is one of the areas that Tim got criticized for. And here's the irony, or the oddity, I guess, of it. You mentioned the Kuyperian part earlier. If you were to go back to the early 2000s when a lot of people were getting to know Tim for the first time, they would have thought of him very much as a Kuyperian, and they would have said, here's the problem. He cares too much about cultural change. He's too focused on changing the world. Fast forward 20 years, and you get my point. They're criticizing him for the exact opposite thing. He doesn't care enough about cultural change. Well, it wasn't Tim who changed. The fact of the matter is, and I verified this with him on multiple occasions, for better or worse, he was an evangelical who believed that evangelism is the highest priority of the church, and that from evangelism, other things would also flow, and also that we would be called to other matters of discipleship. But he tended to see that if the church was being faithful, it was upholding the scriptures and it was evangelizing, it was on mission. And yes, there are people who have come to say, I just cannot really agree with that evangelism should be that priority. Again, I understand, perfectly valid for people to hold that view. But yes, you're going to think that Tim was wrong because that was unashamedly what he did prioritize there. And so when he would even look at an issue like critical race theory, yes, he could evaluate that on its merits, but he would also say, well, part of the witness of the church is us being able to be honest about where the church has fallen short in the past. But sometimes that just doesn't really play well with people. And you end up offending people on both sides who think that you need to be more narrowly suited to one of their camps. So yeah, he just didn't really fit in those areas. And he would have been the last person to say that the next generation should do everything the same way that he did. Because after all, of course, that's not what he did in his generation.
Well, we're coming up to the end of our time here. In fact, we're at it. But the nice part about podcasts is that you can fudge a little bit. And one of the questions I just knew I had to ask you during this conversation is about Tim Keller's death and about how well he died. And this is one observation that I've heard critics and fans alike make. Just people of all stripes have recognized that Tim Keller, in the process of realizing that he was coming to the end of his life, he displayed such a faith, such a trust in Jesus, such a hope for eternity, and such a grace and a certainty about it that it was just impossible not to admire. What did you learn from watching Tim prepare to go home to the Lord? What did he teach us about that?
Well, I think he taught us in some ways that it is still possible in a very divided age to be able to learn from other people and to be respected by a lot of people who disagree with you, not because you were squishy in your beliefs, but because you were kind and loving in your interactions with them, even in your disagreement. It's easy to spend time on social media and think it's gone. It's just not possible. This is just the way things are now. And yet I think his death was a reminder of us that it actually is. It is possible. Now, I'll make one last point here, Shane, that might not have been exactly what you were asking, but it was something that came to mind that might be relevant. I did a good bit of media just related to his death, obviously, because of the book. And I ended up in an argument with somebody from NPR. And I said, I've been surprised I haven't done any television for this. And I said, I think it's probably because of XYZ reasons. She said, no, it's not for those reasons. You're not doing any television because Tim's third way, his nuance, it just doesn't work on television anymore. And it was just I think she's right. And here's what I mean is that I think we can be tempted as evangelicals to forget how much our medium is changing and manipulating and distorting our message. It actually is one reason why I like podcasts, and one reason why I like it when they can go long, because you can get into a lot of nuances in here. You can let the conversation go. You're not cutting to commercial after 4 minutes or something like that. But it just helped you to see that some of the major figures that we've been talking about here of this era, we've mentioned President Trump as one of them, his medium is television. And Tim Keller's death showed his medium was the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the New York Times. And there was a time when television would take its cues from those places, but that's not anymore. It doesn't do that anymore. Television does a different thing. And so one of the things that's happening to us that I think Tim's death should show us is that our faith can be so narrowed or misdirected by the medium in which we are experiencing it, that it can truly lead us astray. And I think when you see there, you see all these people, and I don't think, you never got a sense from those tributes in The New Yorker by Michael Luo or Molly Worthen in The Atlantic, you did not get a sense of, and the reason he got in this publication is because he was willing to compromise his views to make them accord with elite thought. None of them said that. They didn't say that. What they said was, here was a person of unquestioned influence and of great respectability of his intellectual gifting, but also somebody whose manner is impeccable, not because he's perfect by any means. And I'll close on this note, and I think people are probably, I just don't want to attract unwanted attention for this, but we're watching another leader right now spend a lot of time on Twitter, drawing a lot of attention to himself. And it just makes you think, it's just not always your arguments, which I also disagree with in this case. It's just like how you carry yourself. And that's the thing that stands out to me about Tim's death, is that you just don't have to be a jerk to be able to think that you're accomplishing something positive for the kingdom. Sometimes just sticking with the old fruit of the Spirit is the better way to go. So I don't know. That's probably not what you were asking, Shane, but that's really what came to mind as I watched things unfold with his death. I mean, the thing about his death is that it still came as a shock, and I was just gutted, crying, all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, it was something that we had seen coming. And so it wasn't quite that shock, but really just gave us all an opportunity to praise God. It's not just, praises to Tim, because that would have been the worst possible tribute, but praises of God, this God that he served for so much of his life.
What phrase or word sticks with you from Tim Keller?
It's consistent. For better or worse, he just was always the same person. There just was not some sort of radical morphing. And I can say to anybody out there who reads his books or listens to his sermons, and hopefully will for generations to come, I'll just sit there and say, that's the same person I knew. That's the same person who'd call me up and want to talk about who knows, what. And that's the same person. And if anything, I saw spiritual renewal. I saw godliness. I saw sanctification. I saw hope, especially in those last 3 years. And I'll stop on this note. I mean, again, I could talk for too long and already have, but for the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, I was visiting Germany here with Beeson Divinity School, and we went to the place where Luther died. And I'd forgotten what a big deal it was when Luther died, because in many ways he was first into the breach. All the things that he'd fought against, purgatory especially, he's the first into the breach. How's he going to do this? And he died well. And I think, Shane, we live in an era of a lot of skepticism of younger leaders toward what we've seen happen with our elders. And we look and we say, hey, it is possible. By God's grace, it is possible. You can't not just die well, but die on the upswing in a lot of ways, like face first to heaven, not dragged kicking and screaming, but I'm ready, Lord. I'm ready. That's what sticks with me.
That's beautiful. Amen. My guest today has been Collin Hansen, editor-in-chief at the Gospel Coalition and author of Timothy Keller, his spiritual and intellectual formation. Collin, thanks for joining me today on Upstream and for honoring just a modern giant of the faith with your work.
Thanks, Shane.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Be sure to rate the podcast and subscribe in your listening app. You can also connect with us on social media or by visiting upstream.colsoncenter.org.